Hello and welcome back to part 2 of my July wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about mysteries, thrillers, horror, memoirs, and graphic novels. If you're interested in hearing about the science fiction and fantasy I read this month, I'm going to link you to part 1 of my wrap-up. I am going to try to put some timestamps in this video so you can skip over any genres that you're not interested in hearing about. But this is basically everything else I read this month, and I'll jump in. Starting with mysteries and thrillers, I read 2 this month, one that was fantastic and the other one that was, well, not. Starting with the good, I read Final Girls by Riley Sager, which I requested from Dun Books via Netgalley. And this is a psychological thriller all involving a young woman who survives a terrible massacre and is trying to move on with her life. However, the media has given her this title of Final Girl and has lumped her in with all these other survivors who have escaped some terrible massacre themselves. And one of the girls has just died at the beginning of the novel, and the story picks up from there. This book has some really great nods to the horror genre, which if you are a fan of those slasher movies, you'll definitely appreciate, but you don't need to be a fan of them in order to enjoy the book. It's definitely a psychological thriller first, and isn't overly gruesome in my opinion. Other people might be disturbed by some of the difficult content, but I feel fairly safe to recommend this one to just about anyone who reads the genre. Overall, I just thought it was really well done. I thought the characters were well developed, well-rounded, interesting. I thought the writing was quite good for the genre, and I just thought it was just good. It felt fresh, it felt different, and I was really pleased that the ending was not overly obvious. I was not able to predict it and just thought there were some really fun twists and turns, so it's definitely one I recommend. One of the best 2017 releases I have personally read, so thumbs up to that one. Unfortunately, the second book was more of a miss for me, and that was Are You Sleeping by Kathleen Barber, which I won from a Goodreads giveaway. This is another 2017 release, and I'd heard a lot of good buzzy things about it, and I was quite disappointed. This is a mystery that is targeted for fans of the Serial podcast, which is done by This American Life. I think most people are aware of that true crime podcast that is about an amateur journalist who is going around trying to decide whether or not the person who is in jail at the moment is innocent or guilty of the crime that he was convicted for. And this book is straight up meant to be targeted for that audience because it's a story of a woman who is doing a very similar thing. She is a detective who started a podcast in order to decide whether or not this person actually murdered this other man. And the story is actually told from the perspective of the victim's daughter. And that's the biggest reason this book falls apart for me. It really villainizes the podcast and the journalist in this book, and it's just not the right perspective if you're going to write a book that is meant for fans of the podcast Serial. It just was uncomfortable to read almost because it was almost making you feel guilty for the fact that you like the Serial podcast. Otherwise, my main complaints were that I found the characters very uninteresting. I never got fully invested in the story. I found, even though the character names were all different, I still found myself confusing them because they didn't feel very distinct, and the mystery itself was pretty average, and I just don't have a lot of love for this one. It wasn't terrible, but it just didn't work for me, and maybe it was just a little bit too gimmicky. There was some cool moments where they included some social media, including like Reddit and Twitter, and it did feel very authentic, as well as some transcripts from the podcast. However, I just didn't love it as a whole. If you are considering picking it up, I would look to see if there is an audiobook version available, just because I think an audio listening would give you a more podcast-like experience, and that might really bump this book up. Otherwise, I can't personally recommend it. I just thought it was okay. Next, I read one horror book, which was Horrorstör by Grady Hendrix, which was pretty buzzy a few years back, and I've been meaning to check it out for quite a while. This involves a store that looks very similar to IKEA, but is technically not, where a group of employees are working and they are tasked with staying overnight because strange things are happening, and each time they get there in the morning for work, things are out of place, there's stains, and it just seems like someone is breaking in at night, so they are set to investigate and figure out what is happening. I should not have picked up this book because I am not a fan of haunted buildings. I've said before that it's just not a subgenre of horror that I really enjoy. I just find it kind of boring, and I should have known better than to pick up this book. The reason I did so was because of the formatting of the book itself. As you probably heard, it's all designed like an IKEA catalog. It looks so authentic, and the chapters, the images, the diagrams, it's all really fun, and I did appreciate those elements. They were just really funny and just brought an extra layer to the book, which definitely made me appreciate it a lot more. If you're a fan of books about haunted buildings, you might enjoy this one more than I did, but it's still kind of cool and sort of worth checking out just for that really unique book design. Next, I read a memoir called Kabul Beauty School by Deborah Rodriguez, and this was a really great memoir all about a woman who went to Afghanistan after the Taliban were thrown out, and she originally went just to help out. But she, as a trained hairstylist, saw a need in the country for the ability to retrain women as hairdressers, partially because it's a really good way for them to work outside the home, get economic independence, and it was something that was suppressed during the Taliban rule, so it allowed them to really bring back their culture and to bring back their customs. It's a really insightful book. I personally really liked the main character's voice. I know other people found her a little bit of an obnoxious American personality, but I just found her very redeemable. She gives a North American perspective on Afghanistan, and as a survivor of an abusive marriage, she becomes very much a spokesperson for the women in the country and is very interested in helping other women escape bad situations by having the skills and abilities in order to work themselves and to create that independence. So all around, I just thought what she did was really admirable. And you can also tell that she speaks with a lot of love, admiration, and kindness for the Afghani people, particularly the women. You can tell that she grew real friendships and really loves these people. And at the same time, she isn't afraid to show some of the darker aspects of the society, including things like abuse that go on and a lot of the contradictions between the different religious and cultural customs. I just thought it was a really well-rounded, well-balanced account of her experiences in the country, and I just really again admire her as a woman and what she did for the women of the country, and just definitely recommend that one. Finally, I want to talk graphic novels, starting with Pride of Baghdad by Brian K. Vaughan, which was inspired by a true story where an American bombing in Iraq led to an explosion in the zoo which allowed 3 lions to escape, and Vaughan decides to imagine what would have happened to those lions. The entire story is told from the perspective of the lions themselves, and probably because of the animal choice, but this book read to me like a very adult version of The Lion King, which I really enjoyed. The book does deal with some darker subject matter. There is definitely some dark and gruesome images on the page just because of the bombing itself, and also animals as predators. They do go about and act as animals would and do attack other creatures. So certainly not meant for kids, but I just thought it was a really good story. It's nice that it's all contained in one volume. So unlike a lot of other graphic novels, you can just pick this up and read it and get the entire story in one go. And otherwise, I just have to say the writing was of course fantastic, but also the artwork was just beautiful. To give you an idea of what it looks like, I just thought these images were just gorgeous to look at, and I really enjoyed the story overall. I thought it was just a solid read, and I would definitely recommend this one. Now, I also read Volume 1 of Bob's Burgers, which I just found out was made into a graphic novel. It is written by the writers of the show, so it's all fully licensed and has the same humor. If you are familiar with the show, you know it's all about this working family that own a burger shop, and it's just super funny, super inappropriate, and the graphic novel was definitely a lot of fun. While it wasn't quite as good as the TV show, I think that's hard to reproduce. The characters still felt really authentic, the humor was spot on, and it was just a lot of fun. I really enjoyed a lot of the sections, particularly Tina's friend erotic fiction was hilarious. So I do recommend that one for any fans of the TV show. Last, I read a graphic memoir called Hostage by Guy Delisle, and if you know me, you know I love a kidnapping story, so I had to pick this one up. This is the true account of a man who was kidnapped in Chechnya and held for several months. It's not technically Guy Delisle's story, but rather the story that was told to him from the man himself that was kidnapped, and I just thought it was really fascinating. It is a slower story in the way that there isn't a lot of action on the page. This isn't like a lot of gunfights, but more the slow story about someone who is held in captivity over the course of time. So there is a bit of repetitiveness to the structure of the story, that his days very much involve lots of sleeping, occasionally getting to eat and interacting with his captives. But if you're like me, if you find hostage stories fascinating, if you love kidnapping, you should definitely pick this one up. I thought it was so engaging. The artwork itself is quite simplistic, done in kind of like blue and gray tones, but it works very well for the story. And while this is actually a quite thick book, you will read it very quickly. And yeah, I just thought it was a great, engaging story and would definitely recommend it to anyone who enjoys graphic works that involve nonfiction and true stories. So that's it. That is everything I read in the month of July. I'm going to link you to part 1 of my video so that you can hear about the science fiction and fantasy I read this month. But please let me know if you're planning on picking up any of the books I mentioned here today. And I will talk to you again soon in another video. Thank you for watching. Okay, bye.